What's being done currently, or
versus what the recommendation is? Yeah.
Currently, what happens is because we have defined early voting in only one fashion as absentee voting, and we've said you can vote absentee in person at the Board of Elections or at a satellite site that the board would designate. There's a 35-day period where people begin that absentee voting. Most of it, the lion's share of it, is done by mail. And if I might add, in the 2008 presidential election, 30% of the ballots were cast before the election. They were the absentee ballots. So what the reality of it is that more people are taking advantage of the early in-person voting as opposed to the voting by mail. And in that case, you have, with the way things are right now, the way that it's that the law hasn't really caught up with the practices. So you have the issue of the 5 to 7 day overlap, and of course people were very concerned about that. And then you also have the difficulty in administration for boards of elections that people are voting right up until the day before the election. And as I traveled around the state last year, toward getting closer to the election, for instance, the Clark County Board of Elections, they were voting there at the board, and the people there filled up the lobby of the Board of Elections office just before the election. Sometimes they're out the door, especially in cities like Columbus or in Cuyahoga County. And what ends up happening is election workers then are trying to prepare for the election, get materials out to poll workers during those last few days. And what you end up having is sometimes election officials don't go to bed for 48 hours. And I don't think most people function that well on that little sleep. And we do want the elections to be smooth, well-run, accurate, with no questions. So what we would do would be to shorten it on the front end and shorten it a little bit on the back end so that there's 18 days of early voting, but to make sure that we're covering all the people who want to vote in person early, we're providing for more locations. But leaving individual boards with the flexibility to determine how many locations and what those locations are, up to 4, which could include the board office. One last point on this, and don't want to get too technical, but like in Franklin County, when they voted at Guns Memorial, it was a very beautiful setup there. Maybe not quite enough places for people to go, because the lines extended a little bit toward the end of the voting period. But then when someone wants to go to the Board of Elections, they can pick up an absentee ballot there at the board. Literally what some people did was sit in their car in the parking lot, fill it out, and bring it back in. And we just don't think that people have to go to those great lengths to be able to have that kind of convenience. We'd like to make it easier for voters to be able to vote. And then the flip side is that on election day, the lines aren't as long because more people voted.
For example, today there's a special election in Columbus and there's a Southwest Schools. How would those two elections be affected by this if this law was enacted?
Well, we would eliminate special elections, and except for the case of replacement, and that would be done by mail. Today we're spending, from what I understand, over $800,000 for the special election here in Columbus. We have to, I think, consider the difficult economic times we're in out there, and we have to do this in a cost-effective way. I think that we can adjust, and schools and others can adjust to conform to that and understand that the costs involved are very high, and the success rate have not been particularly great for school levies. So they would be required to do the May or the November general election.
Again, at the primary or the general election time would be, if it's an unfortunate situation like the loss of a congressperson, and then it would be done by mail.
I was asking that because in the explanation it says fill a vacancy or a municipal or charter special election. Would those be held by mail?
The charter special election could be held by mail. Again, because of home rule, state can't tell the counties everything that they can do. I think they're very happy about that.
It says the ballot language or ballot issues would be limited to 300 words. Can you give a sense of how long do they get now, and will this put any constraints on the explanations of ballot issues?
Okay, let's start out. Do you ever do Twitter? It's 140 characters, including spaces. And I'm not trying to be trite here, but There are a couple things to think about, and that is better understanding for the voter of the ballot, but also the expenses involved in printing and mailing very lengthy ballots. So in last November's election, we did start out originally with 6 different ballot issues, 3 joint resolutions, a referendum, initiated legislation, and then initiated constitutional amendment. The initiated legislation went away, but the lengths of the ballots were extreme, and it also resulted in quite a bit of postage and mailing costs for the boards of elections, as well as the increased printing. And we, knowing the availability of the full information at libraries, on websites, throughout the internet, and we know not everyone is internet savvy, but it is required to be sent out to different places. We think that this is really adequate for the voters, and we think they'll probably appreciate it.
I'd just like to add, too, this is something that we heard consistently over the summits and election conferences, that the public wanted more simple language, simpler instructions on ballot language, making this a little bit easier to understand. And I think that this is what we're trying to do, streamlining, simplifying the process. So something that we consistently heard during this last year, taking input from the public and from experts.